I think we'll get started. Welcome, welcome. I'm Kate Seeley, Vice President for Arts and Culture here at the Middle East Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, a discussion on women and leadership in the Middle East. We'll be discussing the progress that has been made, the many challenges that remain, and what this group of powerhouse women thinkers here on the stage believe are the next most important steps in this journey toward greater rights, greater representation, peace and security for women in the Middle East. MEI's Arts and Culture Center is hosting this event as part of its programming around our current art exhibition of women photographers from the Arab world and Iran entitled Louder Than Hearts. It's curated by award-winning Lebanese-American photographer Rania Matar, a Guggenheim Fellow, and features 10 outstanding women photographers looking at women and resilience in the region. And it got a wonderful review from the Washington Post earlier in the year, and it's up through the end of the year. So please spread the word, bring your friends out, and when we wrap up today around 5 p.m.-ish, this event will be followed by a networking program with food and drinks, and at around 5:30-ish, we will give a tour of the gallery. It's a 15 to 20-minute tour, so please stick around for the tour. It's led by the director of our Arts and Culture Center, Lynn Snej, and it really is very, very insightful. You get so much more out of the images. And I want to note that today marks the second anniversary of the death of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old Iranian woman who was killed in detention in Iran for improperly wearing her hijab, her headdress. And of course, there's so many other heartbreaking stories like Mahsa's in the Middle East today. In Iraq, Parliament is considering a law this fall that could theoretically make it legal for women under the age of 9 to be married off. Of course, in Afghanistan, as so many of us have heard, it is now unlawful for women to raise their voices in public, in addition to the ban on education. So these are unimaginable setbacks for women in the region, and yet some progress has been made in other countries. Women's higher education numbers are outpacing men, and there are more women in the workforce in the Gulf than ever before. And of course, women continue to mobilize and organize for greater freedoms in the region. So there is hope, and the work of our 4 outstanding speakers today is driven, I'm going to presume, by hope and belief that the future can get better for women if we all work together. Now, moderating today's discussion is Suzanne Kiampour. She's an Emmy-nominated journalist and anchor specializing in global security and the Middle East. And among her many career highlights, she was a foreign affairs and political reporter and presenter at the BBC for 12 years, where she covered many international stories and crises. And while there, she worked on the award-winning podcast series Women Building Peace, a collaboration with Georgetown's Institute of Women, Peace and Security. And today she's the CEO of Helmet to Heels, a digital brand that merges news, travel, and fashion to amplify the voices of extraordinary women worldwide. Now, before I hand the panel over to her, I just want to extend a few thanks. First of all, to Lynn Snej for all of her incredibly hard work in putting this excellent panel together, to MEI's events and comms teams for their invaluable help, and of course, to our panelists and our moderator today for their time and insights. So thank you all so very much. And now I'd like to hand the panel over to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to our panelists, especially on this really important day. I think there couldn't be a more important time to be having these discussions. And I think more importantly, we're not just going to be talking the talk, we're actually going to walk the talk. So with that, I would love to introduce Kathleen Keenast, who is the Director of Women, Peace and Security. I almost said Women Building Peace because I'm so used to saying that word, at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We have Saba Ghouri, who is the Vice President for the Global Networks team at Vital Voices. We have Nadereh Chamlou, a non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council and also a former senior advisor for the World Bank for 33 years with fascinating stories. And Marissa Kurma, who is the program director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. So I would like to start with discussing, I think I live in Dubai and DC, so I go back and forth between these two worlds. And you would think in this day and age you wouldn't kind of feel a sort of as much of a culture shock because we live in such an interconnected world. Just really not the case, particularly in the world of women. And so I really want to start with we often hear about women in the Gulf in particular, but women in the Middle East increasingly working more and being in the workforce more. So I'd like to kind of start with this establishing question for each of you, and to talk about investing in women and the challenges of investing in women during times of conflict, because that's where we are now. So we're seeing a rise in women in the workplace and women entrepreneurs in the region, but we're also seeing a rise in conflicts. So how do we get around that? And let's kick it off with that question.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to the Middle East Institute and Lynn, of course, for convening us today for this really pressing concern on women in war, but women particularly of the Middle East. First of all, on behalf of the Institute of Peace, I really think that these inclusive approaches to thinking about gender equality are really critical. I'll just say for a moment, just so you know where I'm coming from, my own work as a peace builder began 3 decades ago while doing my doctoral research in what was the former Soviet Central Asia region with semi-nomadic groups. I was interested in the Soviet approach to gender equality and what that meant. But while I was there, the Soviet Union collapsed. And I witnessed firsthand what happened to the status of women from the Soviet perspective and what that meant for these semi-nomadic women of what was to become Kyrgyzstan. The number one issue first on this newly elected parliament, it wasn't how do we get food or education to children, it was the issue of polygamy. Men wanted to be able to marry multiple wives. This became a catastrophe for so many of the rights for women, not only in Kyrgyzstan, but the entire Central Asian region, which is predominantly Muslim by, at that point, culture, but now, of course, by religion. I say this because everything we're talking about today could happen anywhere. We talk about Afghanistan. Do you know there are 162 edicts that basically are erasing every day the right to be a woman in any kind of framework? I was in Papua New Guinea a few months back. They're considered right behind Afghanistan as one of the most violent places in the world to be women. It could happen there. So we think of these as like, oh, it's over there. But these women are just like the women here in this room or listening today. They were going along in their everyday lives, conflict at the local level or in many places and noted today globally, women are confronting unbelievable crisis. What do we know? This is what one of my big takeaways is. The more women's equality there is in a country, the less likelihood of violent conflict. We have researchers who have been able to categorically lay this out. Why doesn't our own government place this as then a clear strategy for peace building in the world? You may or may not know that there is an international agreement, 1325, that was set up 24 years ago to say, hey, let's put women in the focal point of war, protect them, but let's also make sure they're at the peace building tables. As one of my colleagues like to say, is the only ticket to the peace table the ability to carry a gun and use it? Because that's what women typically do not do. Women need to be at these tables. Finally, I'll just say that our own US government in 2017 legislated the Women, Peace, and Security Act. It means that 4 agencies and departments are accountable to integrate women into all aspects of peace building. Funny that the Afghan women weren't a part of the decisions that were made 4 years ago. Or how about this? That women really need to be protected. whether they're in security, like they need to have uniforms and protective gear that protects them if they are fighting in war. So those are just two examples that we can launch with, but this is about us as Americans, and it is critically about women who are frontline peace builders in the Middle East and Afghanistan.
So Vital Voices has been one of these examples of what Kathleen is talking about. So tell us a bit about your experience.
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you so much to the Middle East Institute for organizing this very important conversation, and to all of you for being here. It's really important for us to have these conversations and to just consistently raise the importance of women's inclusion and women's programming. So to kind of build off of what Kathleen was saying about women, peace, and security and women's leadership, Vital Voices is an NGO that has been around for more than 2 decades, started by Hillary Clinton, that has established the mission of women's leadership at its core. Our core mission is to empower women leaders around the world, women changemakers around the world who are taking on the world's greatest challenges. We have invested in over 20,000 women around the world. So women at various stages of their lives, women from different sectors, so women entrepreneurs, women political leaders, civil society activists, NGOs, so women-led NGOs, we support them as well. And my own career is that I spent quite a bit of time, of almost 14 years, at the State Department in various bureaus, various offices, where I was supporting and as a donor, human rights organizations, civil society activists, and women's rights activists, and left the government to work with NGOs and to work within NGOs like Vital Voices. But prior to that, I was at Women for Women International, working with women who were on the front line of conflict. And when we hear we hear about all the backsliding that is going on in the world, even in our own country, I want to really emphasize the importance of supporting women leaders and networks. We are doing a lot of work actually in the Middle East. We support women at various stages and various levels. Oftentimes we think of, it's very important to support women leaders who are in parliament, who are in politics, but also at the same time, women entrepreneurs who are trying to build their businesses, trying to invest in them, in their communities, in their own successes, so that they can be successful and help support the communities they're from and the nation building. But also women at the very grassroots level is really, really important, and something that we're doing through a variety of our programs. And I can say that throughout the work that I've done, I have always seen hope in women and the power of women. And when women get together, the network that they have. So for instance, just talking about Afghanistan and what's happening there is horrific with all of these edicts, all of these bans. I recently came from a meeting where Vital Voices supported we supported a network of women leaders, high-level Afghan women leaders 3 years ago when the regime fell to the Taliban. We evacuated over 1,000 women leaders. Most of them were in Albania waiting to be resettled. And now they're all over the world. Some are still in Albania. But women from across the different ethnic groups, different tribal groups, different socioeconomic backgrounds, even some women from inside the country, got together to draft a platform that called for advocacy with the international government and international community to stop engaging with the Taliban, to stop negotiating with them, to not legitimize them. And they were able to do this in a few days, just coming up with the platform. So I give this as an example of how women can work across party lines, across ethnic lines, across religious backgrounds. The 1325, the Women, Peace and Security resolution that the UN passed, a lot is just on paper, but the women are actually implementing it, and we see this across the board and across the world, including in the Middle East and including in a lot of the programs that we support with women political leaders, women entrepreneurs, and activists on the ground.
Are you finding any challenge in continuing to get the investment needed to support these women? So I sit on the Friends of the American University of Afghanistan board, and we're having so much trouble fundraising because of various reasons. Are you seeing that in your work?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's really critical for international organizations, for governments, to continue to support women leaders and women's organizations. We know that when it comes to philanthropy, even in this country, less than 2% goes towards the rights of women and girls. We know that when it comes to international assistance, there's very little foreign aid that's invested on women and girls. Having been and worked at the State Department, I was constantly advocating, constantly fighting for funding to go towards these women-led organizations, and it was frankly an uphill battle. And it is still an uphill battle, and it's really hard to keep the attention on these issues. But they're also interrelated. When we support women and girls, when we support women-led organizations, we see the investments to society. That women invest more in their communities, in their families, in education, in all of these really important critical, and health, all of these really important critical needs for society at large. And so it's a very big challenge when it comes to funding.
So you mentioned attention, and a lot of that is kind of our job as the media, is to maintain attention on these issues and on these stories. I mean, it took me a really long time to get my show off the ground, and then they lost funding for it, even though it won awards and was so impactful. So it's kind of a matter of priorities, right? But 2 years ago, Mahsa Amini was killed at the hands of the morality police, and that her story, her individual story, even though this had been going on, there are so many people, unfortunately, like her, that had experienced torture on some levels at the hands of morality police, but we hadn't heard about these stories. But her story went viral. The Women Life Freedom movement kind of took off, but it's not getting the attention that it was at that time. So Nadereh, I'd like you to kind of talk a bit about why that is, what the challenges around maintaining attention on these issues are, and is it something that is specific to Iran and Afghanistan, or is it women in these conflict and post-conflict and societies in difficulties across the region?
Well, first of all, I want to add my voice to thank the Middle East Institute for organizing this, and I'm very honored to be among this in this panel. I wanted to maybe first start with a question that you asked the other two, my esteemed panelists, about conflict and how to, what to do when conflict is going on. When I worked at the World Bank, I worked on many different regions in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and East Asia, and then I came to work on the Middle East and North Africa region. In all the other regions, there are sporadic conflicts here and there. In the Middle East, I was surprised to see that there is one conflict after another. There is an exhaustion of conflict, all of you. And a lot of it is not just generated by people inside the region, but somehow for this region, there are too many players in this region that create conflict. At the same time, it's a very male-dominated decision-making. So I think that in addition to that, the male perspective. I'm sorry to all of them. Really, I'm grateful that all of you are here. But nonetheless, I want to say that the perception is very different. Honor is very important, and these things. So there is a different reality in the Middle East, North Africa, also Iran included, and Afghanistan by extension, of course, than to other regions that I have experienced. And for the most part of my career, ever since I worked at the World Bank and afterwards, I've focused on economic development, economic growth, economic and so on. And women play an important role in that. Women play a critical role in any country that has been able to really grow fast. Women have come to the workforce, women have come and contributed, or have been able, or have been given the chance to contribute to their economies. But when conflict is happening, when there is a continuous presence of conflict, it's difficult for people to envisage investing, for men and women, but particularly so for women, to be able to invest in a growth-generating activity, because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. You don't know, so you invest in small amounts. You invest in little steps. You don't think big. You don't dream big. You end up having, small. You end up just surviving over the time. And then, unfortunately, when conflict happens, women end up being the ones who have to pick up the pieces. There are injuries. Women end up having to give up their, let's say, work, careers, to take care of people, family members that have been disabled, have not been able to work. So conflict has an incredible impact on women's lives in this region, in any region, but particularly because of its continuous and its persistence in this region. And we are maybe thinking that, okay, conflict happens here. No, but conflict impacts the morale, the thinking, the feeling of everyone from left to right. People who are in Morocco are just as affected by conflict somewhere else in the region. So in a way, the issue of conflict, since we are on that topic, has an important element. Now, coming back to Mahsa Amini, I'm carrying the Zan Zendegi Azadi necklace because I feel so incredibly associated with this movement. That added, it's an internal conflict, but it's a conflict that simplifies or signifies what's going on. People don't know what their tomorrow is. People don't know how the decisions are going to be made about their tomorrows, about that there is going to be dissatisfaction in the air. There is going to be, people are not going to be able to make simple decisions about their lives. And when these sorts of conflicts are not resolved, it ultimately impacts women. It impacts women more than it impacts others. And what we see, for instance, in Iran is, of course, women have been inching and even millimeter by millimeter pushing the agenda forward. Today, when I haven't been to Iran recently, but friends of mine who come, they say, the hijab, they have essentially just like walked all over the regime when it comes to hijab rules, even though 2 years ago they killed for it. But today they feel that they really shouldn't really spur another uprising. But there is more than hijab to the issue. There is much more to it. And I'm so proud of my fellow countrywomen, and I'm sure there are many here, that have pushed the boundaries. And hopefully, and I see, and I've worked in the Middle East quite often, and I see women everywhere, incredible women everywhere that are really, doing their best to, within the very difficult circumstances, to move forward. And I think the future of the region, the future of everywhere, but particularly this region, belongs to the women.
So we're here for both geopolitics and also progressing women's rights in the region, but also we have art to discuss.
Yes.
And the Women Life Freedom Movement was very much also driven by this just explosion of art around the movement. And I was surprised at just how much just how many people who normally wouldn't really be paying attention to the Middle East were messaging me and asking me about the Women Life Freedom movement and how they could help. And so, you know, we're saying that we need to make sure that the world cares about the progress of women's rights, especially women in conflict zones. But how do we take that momentum and apply it across the board? I mean, I think that's, you know, I'd like Marissa to talk about that. That is one of the challenges, is keeping attention on these issues. And so how can we learn lessons from the Masa Amini event and the Women Life Freedom movement to push it forward and apply that?
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing at the Wilson Center on women in the Middle East. So I think the short answer is that we need to encourage the voices from within the region. And there is an abundance of very impressive work being done that sometimes goes unnoticed because, as you mentioned, Suzanne, the priorities in reporting are not there. But I think we are all here sitting talking about this. The Middle East Institute is hosting this discussion because there is a necessity to have this conversation, not just amongst ourselves, but also to cross-pollinate with others. I think what was really, and since we're on the anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death and the movement that it created, I think what was fascinating to me was, at the time, we saw protests, maybe not mass protests, but women-led protests across Arab countries that also came out to support the women in Iran, even in Afghanistan, under all these stringent laws and the oppressive regime of the Taliban. Women were out taking huge risks to support Iranian women. So I think we really do need to give credit to a lot of these women who are on the ground. Sabah, you mentioned civil society organizations and grassroots organizing, and I think this is where you find so many women in the MENA region. Yes, there's progress in the workforce, particularly in the GCC, but I'm Jordanian American, and Jordan has the lowest female labor participation rate for a country that is not at war. And you know, Kate mentioned in her introduction that women are outperforming men in tertiary education, 100% relevant to Jordan, for example, but it's not translating to economic participation. And so, of course, in conflict zones, we're going to see more of a regression. So there are pockets of change that are taking place. And unfortunately, we don't see women in leadership position. This is a report that we published 4 years ago, Ready to Lead. I wanted to make sure that it's called Ready to Lead, because if you look at all the indicators when it comes to education in particular, women are more than ready for these leadership positions, but we're not seeing them in cabinets or parliaments or the judiciary. And if we do, it's, you know, sporadic, right? It's not a strategic decision for a lot of these governments to have women at the helm. But I want to flip the idea of leadership, because I think, given what we've heard from my colleagues on the panel, you see women in so many different sectors, and maybe they're not all CEOs or prime ministers, but leadership is a practice, and we have to stop thinking about it in terms of positions of authority. And if we're looking at leadership as a practice, then women are 100% leading in the region. Of course, that work has to be supported, and we are in a privileged, position here to continue the work, to try to support some of these groups, hear them out, feature the work that they're doing. But there's a lot of very impressive work. I mean, in the research that we've done over the course of the last 6 years I've been at the Wilson Center, we've spoken to women entrepreneurs who, against all odds, made it. Maybe their businesses are not, being sold in the London Stock Exchange or listed there, but they are impacting their communities, their societies, and they're becoming role models. And I think this is the second part that I think we need to highlight. We need to tell these stories. We need to feature role
Yes.
models, because you cannot be what you cannot see. And I think for the next generation, it does make a difference to highlight these stories. We talk about the challenges and the barriers to entry and the barriers to moving up the ladder in any kind of government or non-governmental setting. Those exist, those are real, but we also need to talk about the how. How do you address these barriers? How do you talk about the success and also celebrate it? It's okay to celebrate it, even in the midst of conflict. In a few weeks' time, we're going to also commemorate the attacks of October 7th and the war in Gaza. And with all the horrific coverage out of the Gaza Strip, and particularly the way that it has impacted women, I still see stories on social media of women engineers who figured out how to use just random equipment that they found to heat water or make ad hoc kitchens and cook for whoever. It's not just their families anymore, it's everyone is their family now. It's anyone who's they're being displaced with. And I think this is extraordinary, because we really have to pause and think about how they have the capacity to do this. Again, women are ready to lead. There are more opportunities. U.S. government to governments in the region, we need to talk about this seriously, because it's a lost opportunity. Half of the population is women. In the public sector, 50% of employees are women, but they just need to be supported. The barriers need to be addressed. A lot of these are technical issues. They just need to be addressed.
This is exactly why I started Helmet to Heels, which is kind of geared mostly towards the next generation to kind of inspire. And the Gen Z generation in particular, they are news avoidant but globally curious. And one of the reasons why they're news avoidant is because they feel like the way news is delivered to them isn't relatable to them. They don't see themselves represented. And so they get their information from TikTok and Instagram, which is not always accurate. And there's this big divide between traditional legacy media like the BBC and then TikTok. Like, I was just at the Democratic Convention, and there was the press gallery, and then there was the Creators Lounge, and the Creators Lounge was like a disco, and the press gallery was really rough. And so they look for hope, and they look for solutions-based stories. So on that note, I want to go to the kind of looking forward to the next chapter of women building peace and security around the world. And I think one of the ways to get everybody excited about supporting women in leadership roles is arming them with kind of one piece of information, one talking point, which is, how does having women in leadership benefit society? Like, what are actual tangible, like each of you, what is a tangible response to that question that you could then impart on everybody in this room who can go out and say, this is why we need women in charge? I mean, we all know, we can probably list them, but I just want everyone to kind of give the first thing that comes to you. I'll start with Marissa.
Sure. There's research that was done on this. Women at a negotiating table are more likely to think about outcomes for community and more likely to compromise and thinking about the greater good. And this has been supported by evidence. Now, for those who are not following data, there are ways to tell stories too. And I think if we combine the storytelling with this, evidence-driven approach, I think we can amplify that particular message. That it's not just benefiting one company that I care about or one party within a government. I'm in this negotiation thinking about how I'm going to benefit my community. And that's very powerful.
Nadereh, you said something, I'm pretty sure it was you. You should take credit for it in case it isn't.
Okay.
Which was, art pieces survive centuries, but economic reports come and go.
Well, this part, I made, when we were talking, I made that reference to the fact that a lot of people think that if there are women ministers and they're in charge of, let's say, culture or education, these are lower level cabinet position than, let's say, Minister of Economy and so on. And of course, I used to think like that too, that Minister of Economy is more, of course, because they're in charge of allocating resources. But when you look back, for instance, whatever we admire about any culture are the art pieces, are the creative pieces that those societies left behind, rather than, for instance, how much was the inflation at that point in time, or how much was, I don't know, let's say the growth rate particularly. So in other words, these positions of art and culture which deal with building identity, building the self within a society, building the history of the society, they are very important in the long run. If I could make maybe 2 points very quickly, sure. I don't want to take away on the leadership and what women bring to the table. There have been so many studies. There is no lack of evidence that women bring a different thing to the table, be it from the studies of companies that have more women on the board, that they have a better rate of return, to, for instance, in India, there have been a lot of these studies where when women are in charge or are included in the leadership discussions, for instance, they decide on different things. For instance, building the community better, whereas, for instance, when there are more men and they have been sort of like, they build roads out of the village. So there have been many studies of how the inclusion of women makes a difference. Then my other point is, because you raised the issue about funding. Why is it that there isn't enough funding? I have come across, it's always very interesting that people think, yes, gender issues are so important. Somebody else must be funding. You must get a lot of funding from somewhere else, isn't it?
They just assume.
They just
people assume that I have so much investment.
Yeah, because everybody must be just giving whatever money to this cause. And the other thing is that everybody thinks that women can do a lot with small money.
Yes. We were just talking about
so
that.
the cause of the fact that you must be getting so much money from elsewhere that I don't need to contribute to you, and then the combination of why do you need so much money? Women should do less. Anyway, so that's I thought of adding that to the.
So how do we change that? How do we change that mentality?
By proving that there is a big difference with that we make a difference. That everything, and I think that in the Middle East region, I think that the GCC countries, particularly the smaller GCC countries, which depend on labor force participation rates, are trying to make a difference, which other countries in the region are now copying, kind of looking at that experience. For instance, when Dubai says, I want to have at least 1 or 2 women on the board, I'm getting now, for instance, requests where Kuwait may want to do the same thing. Tunisia, isn't it? So in other words, these little countries are actually becoming almost like the kind of experimental, the laboratories for the rest of the region to experiment.
From my take in Dubai, I spend a good amount of time in Riyadh now too. I covered Saudi Arabia 10 years ago. So to see the evolution has been fascinating. Yeah. And it was actually the UAE who kind of started women empowerment as being cool.
Yeah.
And so now it's trendy, and we'll take it. Because hopefully it kind of drives this force. But the money is still not there. 0.8% of female startup founders in the region are female. So there's still a long ways to go. But I wanted to have you answer the question as well of kind of what benefits come to society from women leaderships, and also how we overcome these challenges.
Yes, I think one of the major ways to overcome the challenges is, again, continuing. Really, it's important to invest in women holistically. And when I say that, I look at because I was thinking about, the storytelling and what Marissa was talking about. There are so many amazing stories of what women are doing. And at Vital Voices, we have programs that support high-level women entrepreneurs, like Fortune 500 companies, but we also have, for instance, programming in the Middle East. One is called the Vital Voices Grow program that supports, it's an intensive 3-week online program that supports small and medium-sized business women to grow their businesses, give them the skills, help them get the skills to take it to the next level. But then at the same time, in talking about crisis, we have a crisis response fund that's actually supporting women around the world who are in crisis, but specifically in Gaza right now. We have already supported 80 women through an organization called Palestiniyat that is working with women journalists, actually, and healthcare workers, has been doing so for many years, but with the war going on, obviously needs any and all kind of support. So we support women at all of these various levels. And it's really, there's so many amazing, courageous women out there that are doing this work. But I think the evidence is there. We know the data, as we've talked about on the panel, but it's about it's about implementing it. And one of the things that I've seen work in my previous work is engaging with men and boys. Men's engagement programming is really important, because at the core of this is unequal power dynamics and patriarchy.
Yeah, exactly.
And it takes years. It takes years of investment. It takes years of change. We have to work starting from schools, primary education. Curriculum needs to be there to where everyone sees the benefits of gender equality, and everybody sees the importance of why it is really helpful and practical for men too to see the importance of gender equality and how toxic masculinity is really harmful to them as well. We're all in these boxes, of how we're supposed to behave, how we're supposed to interact, how we're supposed to express emotions or not express emotions. And if we can get to the core of it, which is investing at the community level, at the grassroots level, but also at the highest levels too. It can't just be, at the highest levels. It has to be the range of, it has to be at all aspects of society, everybody, governments, from the government to the private sector, to the UN, to multilaterals, to civil society, to NGOs, have to be addressing this if we want to see the change that we want to see. And the problem is the investment just isn't there. But also it takes years to, for instance, change these cultural norms that continue to hold women back.
Yeah, especially in the Middle East. Let's broaden it out for Kathleen to help us wrap before we open it up to questions. So I find that men do well when we give them numbers and we kind of keep it simple, They're not really good at multitasking. I get into this with my fiance all the time. It's like, how are you a journalist? Like, you have to do a million things at once. And so how can we quantify just how beneficial having women in leadership roles is to a country in an economy, for example?
Yeah, I think you have to do two things. We do need the institutional change. We need the top down. So I wanted to go back. Norway mandates now any private organization must have 50% women, 50% men. Okay, that might seem heavy-handed, but it is one way you start changing behaviors. And we know just having one woman at the table is not enough. You need to have a force, and you need to demonstrate that force. And sometimes institutional mandates. I think I want to add the religious fabric here and faith leaders. We need faith leaders, religious, most of them are men, but they need to be engaged in this shift. It's a critical element of peace building that has to be a part of our narrative as well. And we see that in leaders who are beginning to recognize in their own domains sexual violence committed by their own religious leaders. We need change agents who are men to help create the space for also women to make a difference. We call it peaceful masculinities. We don't do anything on women, peace, and security unless we're talking about peaceful masculinities. Because we know that men are truly the key perpetrators of violence in the world, but they are also the key victims of violence as well. We forget how victimization of young men, and boys actually help create this cycle of violence. Violence begets violence. We must unlearn it in every part of our lives, which brings up the grassroots approach. I always say we can create a lot of opportunities, but unless the mindset between the right and the left ear changes at the grassroots level, and it does begin with women here too, because in most parts of the world, women raise children, both boys and girls. And we have to look at ourselves as women, how we perpetuate expectations for young boys. And we are a part of the system. If we can't get into the binary, we have to, as you were saying, at the community level, come to agreement about how we raise our boys and our girls to help create more peaceful alliances. Because just adding women, we've been doing that a lot, really, Suzanne. We've added a lot of women, and it's not enough unless we really think about our mindsets. Because, let's face it, women who've had to go through the processes of these male, if you want to call it patriarchal systems, they often adopt practices to be able to navigate and survive.
You act like a man.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's face it, women have had the opportunities to have more identities in the masculine sphere than men have had the opportunity to adopt and really value the feminine qualities as well. We all have both. We're not just one or the other. And so I think, really, I loved this concept of leadership in practice. Moving it beyond the binary and looking at that. Again, it takes institutional change, and sometimes it has to be mandated, like the Women, Peace, and Security Act in this country. But we need civil society to keep those kind of actions accountable. Civil society is what changes the world, and women are often in that lead. And we need to, indeed, fund them. We need to prize them. We need to take their art and really put it forward, because it is how we reimagine ourselves as a global community.
It really does make a huge difference. The BBC actually had a mandate where 50% of people on air had to be women, but that wasn't the case when it came to leadership. And so I was at the BBC for 11, 12 years. By the end of it, I finally had female bosses who were actually empowered. Like, I'd had female bosses, but they weren't empowered to really do anything. They'd worked so hard to get to that place of finally getting to the table, and so they didn't really want to ruffle any feathers. And so we do see the difference when women are in positions of real leadership. I mean, in the Gulf, I think like Saudi Arabia is a good example of where we're seeing rapid movement, but I think there's still a ways to go in terms of how much genuine power there is. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions. I will say they must be questions. If it turns into a comment, I will interrupt. I will be refereeing. I drive a hard game. Okay, let's start up here. And then we'll go to our male ally next.
Hello, I'm Dr. Elaine Soreo. I'm the Associate Rector of Ukrainian American Concordia University, which is a Ukrainian university based in Kiev, Ukraine. And they are still functioning throughout the war.
Wow.
I'm really glad to be here today, and particularly hearing all the comments. And what I'd like to focus on is to try to bring together a point that was brought out and has had integral parts to women at the table and so forth. When we saw the U.S. working with negotiating with the Taliban, not only were women not at the table, but the duly elected government of Afghanistan was not at the table. The only ones that were at the table were representatives from the U.S. government, State Department, Pompeo's representatives, and so forth. And this really dealt a major blow. Why? Because since there were no Islamic representation, the Taliban could negotiate in bad faith because they were only negotiating with non-Islamic parties. So how do you get by so many complex things, not only needing women at the table, but making sure that everyone understands the rules of the game, so to speak? And it obviously was not understood there, and what we have today in Afghanistan is the horrific, totally beyond words descriptions of what's happening to the women of Afghanistan.
Get a couple questions.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna. Okay, so we will keep that one. Yeah.
It's me?
Yes.
Okay,
and
thank you.
then
I'm Jamal from Jordan. I just want to thank Mersa about her note that in Jordan we have the lowest rate of women participation in the labor market. Though Jordan, there is no war. From my work, 2013 with UN Women briefly about budget or sensitive gendering budget. Okay, what could increase women participation in the labor market, and what could really provide a real opportunity, actual opportunity, to increase women participation in the public sphere. Which from my brief work, two major barriers. One of them is transportation, and second is kindergarten. This is the two problems that makes women unable to take actual opportunities in the labor market. Regardless of all of this rhetoric and all of these tens of millions spent in Jordan about women issue and all of this rhetoric, without solving these two problems, there will be no actual change. And from my just experience, let me call it, I don't have ability to document this now. There is actual barrier that prevents developing socio-political barrier. Prevent developing transportation system, reliable transportation system in Jordan that could really makes it easy for a woman or for a female in general to leave home and go work and go back home safely.
But
And the second issue, sorry.
No, go ahead.
That the second issue, it's about caring kids or children.
Childcare,
Especially preschool ages. And so, thank you for allowing me to raise this. And sorry for.
But does is it the state who would then step up and say, okay, we're going to create an infrastructure? It's like, how would that work?
Yes, when it comes to transportation, it is a challenge even for young people who are seeking job opportunities in Amman, in the capital, because other jobs are not being created fast enough in other cities, right? So the transportation, but I think the key here, and I heard somebody say safe transportation, that is the key.
Yeah.
That is also linked to the sociocultural mindset that how am I going to let my daughter, my sister out, and God knows what will happen in that bus or that fast train. That is part of the conversation that we have to have. And Sabah, thank you so much for raising how important it is to have this conversation with young boys and with men. You know, I had family members who had garment factories in the north, in the qualified industrial zones, and they, you know, put advertisements for women in the community in order to come and work, and then no one came. So they decided, we're going to go and knock on every single door. And he said, I drank so much tea that summer. So, like, it was, you know, the tea is very sugary. So much tea because I sat down and I had to negotiate with the families, because that's the other thing. Unfortunately, the decision of females to work is not her own.
No.
So there is something that we have to also, you know, think about. There's a legislative issue with the personal status laws or the family laws that is there, but there's also this socioeconomic challenge. The child care services, there is a law in place for the private sector in particular, where if you hire more than 20 women with a certain number of children, then you are mandated to have a creche or a child care center. And of course, if you're a business owner, you're not going to hire that 20th woman. But there are organizations that are trying to have this conversation. One of my favorite organizations working to lobby with the government and with the community is called Sadaqa, and it's women from the community. They go to the Ministry of Labor, they go to Parliament, and they go to business associations, and they have this conversation. So I think going back to the, you know, some of the points raised, this work takes time.
Yes.
A long time. When we have to have the strategic patience to work through it.
Yeah.
Can I make a point here? I mean, I agree with everything that you said, really, truly. But I coming back to conflict, just making a circle back.
Yeah.
It's true that Jordan is not at war, but Jordan has had to deal with Iraqi refugees, Syrian refugees, and the amount of resources that have been displaced to deal with that issue has taken, has not been dealt with a real life. I mean, building the transportation system, building these other things, because the state has had to deal with these other big problems that are at its doorsteps, and these are not small problems. I mean, so in other words, when I said that even if in the countries where you don't have war, you're affected by conflict, because Jordan is a good case.
And then when there's these times of conflict, and you're, you know, going back to your question about negotiating, I mean, how do you make sure that those negotiations are actually happening in good faith, and the promises that are made in these spaces will be kept?
Yeah, I mean, I think to address that question, it is, as you said, I mean, it's so difficult and complicated. And I think as civil society, as NGO activists, what we can continue to do is support the efforts, the advocacy efforts of civil society, of women's organizations who are calling out the U.S. government and other governments who have not fulfilled their promises. When it comes to the Afghanistan example, for instance, but in so many other instances. And as you were also, Marissa, talking about the transportation issue, reminded me of the importance really of working across like civil society and governments. For instance, we've supported a woman in India, a woman leader named Elsa de Silva, who has started an app called the Safe City app. So basically, she's working with different governments. It was in a couple of cities across India, but now it's spread to countries around the world where people, and it's a public awareness around the app, working with organizations and having different local cities adopt it as well, so that people know that, okay, that area, that specific area may not be safe for you to walk, for you to take transportation at this point. So just that there's more awareness around things like sexual harassment and harassment in public places and in public spaces, because governments won't think about those things often, but it's the advocates and the NGOs and civil society that can remind them.
Yeah. We had a question in the middle right here, yeah.
Good afternoon. This is fabulous, ladies. Thank you. And I admit I'm an American and my lens is limited because I'm in region about 2 to 3 weeks every year in the UAE, in Ajman, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. So I'm going to put on my capitalist hat for a moment. Are we seeing changes in the region due to the amount of women moving from the United States, from Russia, from Europe, from North Africa, who are starting businesses? And is there any impact for women that are local, or are the businesses hiring the expat women to take those roles and jobs? Second question, follow-up. When I'm in region, everyone is talking about Saudi and Saudi's push to step into a lane where they are considered the preeminent country in the region as far as economic development. So are we seeing changes for women in Saudi Arabia to enter the workforce and to have more opportunity? That's my question.
Let's take one more. Let's take one. Right. Well, yeah. And then we'll get to you afterwards. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Alexandria. My question is, what is the global impact of what happened in Afghanistan with the Taliban when it comes to women's rights, with the repression of women's rights? What is the global impact of that? How is that? Do we see that is that gonna be contained in the region, or is it gonna be spreaded to other parts of the world as we have more authoritative or type of regime sprouting? I'm just kind of curious.
So I think question 1 is for Marissa. Question 2 is for Kathleen. Let's start with question 1.
So the impact of expat workers coming in. I mean, with a lot of the investment laws or entrepreneurship laws, you have to have a local partner in order to start a business. So that's always one way to guarantee that local partners are included. I know that there has been a steady increase in women entrepreneurship, but it's still, across the region, it's still very low. I think the average worldwide is close to 25%, and the region is close to between 5 and 7%, which is pretty low. And I want to go back to this report because one of the key findings of this Ready to Lead report, and we thought it was fascinating, and so we decided to do another report focused on that, is the nexus between women's leadership and inheritance laws. And in countries, in the vast majority of the region, there's unequal inheritance because it falls back on Sharia law. And that impacts women's financial independence, their ability to make decisions financially. And when we took that and we decided to look at entrepreneurship, access to capital was a key barrier. And even in countries where you can actually access, go to a bank and apply for a loan, there's a socio-cultural mindset that is still questioning, well, where is your male guardian? They still have to, how do we know that you're going to spend pay back? I spoke to the first Jordanian women to be elected to a business association a few years ago for a podcast. And she said that in many cases with women-owned businesses, for example, they're just registered under the woman's name, but they're really run by their husbands. So there are these stories, but that's why, going back to sort of the holistic approach, we really have to unlock it from different angles, right? There's the legislative angle, but then you reform a law, you have to implement it. So you have to make sure that it's being implemented. And then you have the more adaptive behavioral issues that, includes the curriculum, that includes the going back to Suzanne, your point, the role of the media. So that at so many levels, I think this is there. I mean, in the GCC, you travel to the region, so you can tell me if I'm wrong. There's a lot of intermingling, maybe in the workplace, with different nationalities. Mm-hmm. But I think the locals will still go back to sort of their own cultural setting. Mm-hmm. I don't see it making a huge impact that way. But I do see a lot more women becoming more passionate and active in the workforce and wanting to actually give entrepreneurship a shot. So like when you talk to the young generation, they are less risk averse than their parents were. So the change is happening. Again, it's going to take time.
So let me just say one thing on the question about expats. In various regions that I've worked in, expats who are women are considered a third gender.
Yeah.
So they're allowed the rights of certain men. It's literally a different set of expectations. It's another thing that we don't talk about a lot. We tend to be in a binary framework, but really there is a third gender norm operating there. In terms of the impact of Afghanistan on the world, let me begin. Once the international world basically took a step back from human rights as a form of standard, what we see are harmful traditional practices reemerging that the Taliban have no accountability, including early marriage. I mean, come on, 9 years old, that's pedophile. Polygamy. We know that polygamy represents very complex social challenges. The inheritance that was just mentioned, the ability to work, it is just a spiraling down because of this machine. These kind of practices are now being easily transferred. And I'll mention Papua New Guinea again, where this small device is spreading technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and it is socializing and normalizing extreme forms of violence against human beings. Doesn't matter the age or the sex. And so all of these dynamics, I think, basically the Taliban, it's like, Pandora's box. It's open now. And all of the progress we made after World War II, we are seeing drastic regression at a global level. It's massive. And it's not just the Taliban, it is technology facilitated amplification of the Taliban to all of these extreme ideas about power, control, and authoritarian rule. So I think it's very dangerous. I think we're at a dangerous moment.
Well,
Can I make one small comment, a very small comment?
very small because we're getting eyes.
No, just like I just coming back to the inheritance. Yes, it is true that women don't have the same inheritance rights, but they do inherit. And when you go across the Middle East, at least within Islam, you're supposed to be. Women are in charge of their own inheritance. And what you see, what something that struck me when I started working on the Middle East is the number of gold and jewelry shops that you have all over the place, which means that this is where women are spending their money. They could be spending their money on investments, on kind of creating investment funds and everything. And when you look forward, women are going to be inheriting more, just simply because the size of families are getting smaller. So when before there were 8 or 9 children in a family, now there are probably 4. So the amount that a woman is inheriting is probably now larger than what it was a generation ago. So there is an opportunity now to really address women who do have the means, instead of investing them in luxury goods, to put them into some productive processes, investment funds and everything, to help other women, entrepreneurs or so that we don't always have to depend on the men to give the money.
At least
So
invest in
that's-
gold bars. But you know, for a while, Chanel bags had a 25% appreciation rate, better than real estate.
No, but in the sense that, you know, but it still is not productive for the region. It's not productive.
On that note, we have to wrap,
Yes.
but we have networking afterwards. So those questions that I couldn't get to, come and find us. So we'll answer your question in there.